Before we can start editing and creating our own plants and trees, it's good to have an idea of what exactly makes up these plants and trees within Vue. So first thing we're going to do is just load in a tree and a plant. And the reason I separate the two is because with trees we have branches with different sets and types of leaves that are being created on that. And you'll see the differences once we start isolating these different materials. The first thing I'm going to do is just grab our plum tree and click OK. And now we want to take a look at the material for this tree, more specifically what's actually creating our leaves. So we're going to double click on our plant to pull up our plant editor. And then we're going to click on our little leaf right here. And now we can see that the material that's making up our plant is this small cluster of branches and leaves. And I want to take a closer look at this material. So this is something we can do for all of our objects. And what I'm going to do is just click OK, and we're going to exit out of our plant editor. And I'm just going to move this over to the side a little. And I'm going to add a plane. And we'll move that down just a little. And now we're going to go up to our plum tree. And we want to make sure that we have our leaf material selected so we can use these arrows to cycle through the bark and the actual leaves. And I'm just going to click and hold onto this and drag it onto our plane. And now if we just move our camera above this a little, we can get a better idea of exactly how this material looks and how it works. And another thing we can do is also use this as a reference to create our own, if we choose to. So if we wanted to bring this material into Photoshop and use it sort of in a background layer, and that way we can take a look a little bit better to see where we should have placements of things. If you're not just going to do it entirely by yourself, we're going to be entirely customizing this, but I'll show you, in case you do want to separate this material, how you can do that. And the first thing we want to do is just pretty much center our camera on the material. And as you can see, as I'm moving the camera, it can be a little bit glitchy with the side right here. In other words, making large steps and jumps on our axis instead of smoothly moving along. So what we can do is select our main camera, and we're going to go to the ruler tab, and then we could use these settings in here to adjust our camera's direction and position if we wanted to be a little more subtle about it. But that should be fine right there. I just zoomed in on this one part. And now we also want to make sure that we have a good background. Currently right now, this is casting shadows onto our ground plane, which is rendering and showing up. And that can interfere with the way we want our map to be preserved. So what we're going to do is click on our plane and double click to enter our advanced material editor. And I'm just going to turn off cast shadows and receive shadows. Now receive shadows isn't that important because we really don't have anything else in the scene that's going to be affecting it. But in case you want to isolate a material within a scene and not have to create a separate one, it's good to have that turned off. So I'm going to click OK. And now we're going to take a look at our render options. I'm going to change this to square, set it to a final render, render to screen, and I'm just going to render 600 by 600. And with our finished render, we can actually see that there's a lot of pixelation and some large blocks in here that are pretty much distorting the way our image looks. So what we want to do is just bring this all the way down to just our color map and remove anything else that's affecting it. So we'll go back into the material editor for this plant on our plane. And now I want to edit the function. And we can use from the color or the bump or anywhere where there's bump production or production of any sort of map in the function editor. Just click edit function. Doesn't matter which one we do it in because it will pull up all of our options. And now what I want to do is remove this bump map, which is probably the major cause of that problem. And we want to make sure we keep our transparency on and our color on, and click OK. And now let's go ahead and re-render that. And we can see that that fixed our little problem that we were having with those blocks in there. But I want to lighten this up a little bit more too. So what I'm going to do is go to our atmosphere editor and just change the pitch of the sun a tiny little bit so that it's shining more directly on the surface and it's a little bit more lit up. We also want to make sure that we don't have any highlights, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and just drag those down to 0. And with the highlight global size, 1% is fine, because since we have nothing in the intensity, it won't show up. And now if we actually wanted to see the full color map too, without our transparency production, we could see that as well by going back into our function editor. And then we can delete our clip map. But in this case, it's just going to be a black background. Delete that. We'll take a look, because we can still see our image map. And click OK. And we turn our transparency off completely. Now we can see we just have that black background on there. So if you really want to use this as a reference, and you can do this with any of your other plants and any of the trees, you could just isolate it like we have and then render it. And then if you want to save that off, and you could open it up in Photoshop, of course you'll need to crop off the edges. And since most of these materials aren't very high resolution, you also don't need to render them very high. The custom maps we're going to be creating are going to be a lot higher of a resolution, and that way we can zoom into the leaves a little bit farther. And now what I'm going to do is just delete this plum tree, and we're going to load in one of the plants. And we'll load in the fern and click OK. And I want to move this off to the side so we just see our plane. And I'm going to take our material and drag that onto our plane. And now we can just see the leaf that's being used to create the fern. And most of our plants are like this, where it's just one leaf creating the entire plant. So this is another way too. We could just isolate this and use it maybe as a reference, or just use it as an idea to create our own. And in this case, what we'd also want to do is turn those shadows back off and some of those other materials if we were actually going to render this and possibly use it or modify it. And you'll see that all of our different materials have different leaves on them. And if we go back to our trees, we can see we'll grab our fall cherry tree, click OK, and let that load in. And we'll select the leaves of our cherry tree and drag that on. And we can see that overall map now that's creating all of the leaves for our cherry tree. And I'm just going to double click on our main camera so we see it full view. But one thing to definitely keep in mind is you always want to take a look at your texture first before you go editing a tree and see what's already on there. Because some trees, depending on the density and what you're creating, might not need as many leaves to be created. And we can take a look right here and we can see that there's actually not many leaves or many branches creating this material. So therefore, when we make a modifying texture for this plant and this species of plant, we want to make sure that we're using a minimal amount of leaves because of the density that we have with our fall cherry tree. And now that we have a fairly good idea of what it is that we need to create in order to modify this plant, we're going to go over to Photoshop and customize some leaf clusters.